Okay, so in today's lecture, this week we are talking about histology. And so we're going to have a little bit of a different approach of how we're going about to discuss this. Okay, and so for histology, what we're going to be focusing on is structure and function. Okay, so we're going to talk about structure and function in relation to organ systems, because you should already have a general idea of the way what the function is of the organ systems are and what it is that they do. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So there are four main types of tissue that we have. So you have epithelium, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and also nervous tissue. So the main thing with epithelium, so you have two different layers for the epithelium. So if I draw this single layer of cells here, they have nuclei here in the middle. And then what's here at the top, this layer at the top, we call that the apical layer. And the layer that's here at the bottom, we call this the basal layer. Okay, so two main parts of the epithelium. And so what's primarily going on here at the apical layer of epithelium, mostly, what it interacts with is fluids. So a lot of fluids are going to be passing through this epithelium. Okay, and so for the function of the epithelium, generally speaking, right, we're going to get more specialized and talk about the specific sites, but generally speaking, what it is that occurs in the epithelium. So you have, so for function, I'll just put, so secretion, absorption, and also protection. Secretion, absorption, and protection. All right, so that's it for the epithelium. For the connective tissue, so there's different, we're going to talk about the different various types of connective tissue, but the first thing that I think about of connective is like, what does it do, right? Connect stuff. Connective. Okay, so but for the function of them, we'll just write so connective, so it connects things, it also protects things, it supports, it also functions as a energy reserve. So the more specific type of energy reserve is adipose tissue. But these are, some of the main functions here for connective tissue. All right, so for muscle tissue, I think everyone knows what's going on with muscle. What does muscle help you do, right? You go lift weights. What's going on there? Contractions, right? Muscle contractions. And so for muscle tissue, you have contractions and the relaxation of muscle. So this is what allows movement to happen. Okay, so what about the nervous tissue? What is the function of that? With nervous tissue, we have electrical impulses are going to travel. And so this is how the nervous tissue, it communicates with one another. And so there are neurotransmitters that we'll learn about later on once we get to the nervous system. But mainly, we're using electrical impulses in order to interpret our environment. Right, it's helping us to interpret our environment, helping us to see, think, to feel, and help us move. Right? Because what the nervous tissue does, that is what controls our muscle tissue, right? So you can think about the skeletal system, right? Those are the bones. That's where the muscles attach to them. But then you have the nervous system or the nervous tissue, which is what those electrical impulses, or it's what's going to allow us to move. Okay. So then, but how do we bind like epithelium and then the muscle, and then even think about like fat? Fat is considered connective tissue. But all these things here, so the connective tissue, that's what's going to help to bind the epithelium, and that's what's also there's a lot of connective tissue and muscle. Right, so the same thing, if you think about like organs and stuff, or so like muscles, there will be like a layer and then there'll be fat, right? Whenever, fat can be stored here in the belly, right? And so it's like kind of like that connective tissue before you get to the skin, okay? So this is just a generalized function of the different types of tissues and everything. And so now we're going to start to go through each of the different ones and discuss them. Okay, so for the first one we'll talk about is epithelium and like the different types. So for epithelium, we have different ways about describing their features. Okay, so you have two main types. So you have simple, and you also have stratified. So if we say that the epithelium is simple, what we're referring to is the layers. So like what I drew earlier, this is a simple epithelium because there's only a single layer. If we say that it's stratified, that means that there's more than one layer. Okay? And so we also just have another term to describe the shape of the type of epithelium. And so there are three main terms that are used. So you have simple squamous, simple cuboidal, and also simple columnar. So if a cell is squamous, what we're saying is that that cell is flat. If the cell is shaped like a cube, if it's cuboidal, it means it's shaped like a cube. If it's columnar, it's shaped like a column, right? So fairly straightforward. And so what we can do is we can combine these terms together to describe the epithelium. So when you look at histology and you're looking at the epithelium, you don't have to really memorize anything. All you have to do is just look in there and see, is there one layer or is there two? What's the shape of the cell? Is it flat? Is it shaped like a cube? Or is it shaped like a column? And then you just combine the terms together. So for instance, simple, we just combine the terms. So you can have simple squamous, you can have simple cuboidal, you can have simple columnar. You can have stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, and stratified columnar. Okay? But now let's think about the function of these different types. So for simple squamous, the function of that, so one of the main functions is diffusion. And so the first two organ systems that I think about is the respiratory system. So within the lungs, oxygen has to diffuse into the lungs. And so if we have a single flat layer of cells, it's easier for the process of diffusion to happen. This is also a similar case within the kidney. Within the glomerular capsule, there's a layer of simple squamous to where the fluid the fluid that's being filtered, right, it has to pass through, and in order for it to get through that, it needs it passes through the simple squamous. But what's the difference between the two? Between respiratory versus urinary? What's the difference in the fluids? So with respiratory, right, we're breathing in air and oxygen and everything that's in there, so that's a gas. Compared to in the kidneys, we're filtering fluid. But the function of the epithelium is still the same, right? We're still like stuff is still diffusing. Okay, so the next one, let's go to simple cuboidal. So for simple cuboidal and simple columnar, both of these are mainly secretion and absorption. So this is kind of like, so we'll do it like that. And we already know what's going on over here, so I'm going to erase this. Okay, so if we have, so we're good on these. So now let's speak generally about stratified squamous and cuboidal and everything. So if it's stratified squamous, the main function here to protect is from abrasion. Abrasion, we'll just put protection, because it's protecting things. So for instance, in the esophagus, you'll see that there are multiple flat layers. And so we have those multiple flat layers because to prevent, abrasion from happening if there's some damage to the tissue or anything like that, okay? So that's stratified squamous, so multiple layers of flat tissue. When we talk about stratified cuboidal, we also talk about, so this is going to be, protection and secretion, and for columnar, stratified protection and secretion. Secretion absorption. Okay, so this is the generalized thing here for the epithelium, all characterizing the tissues and everything. So the next one we're going to go to is the connective tissue. So with connective tissue, there are three main types that we have. So the first type of connective tissue that we have, so you have loose and dense so it's proper. So it's connective proper tissue. So proper is divided into two subcategories, as I said earlier. So you have loose and dense connective tissue. We also have the fluid component, which includes blood and lymph. And then the last, proper, fluid, and then the last type of connective tissue is for support. So we have bone and cartilage. All right, so this is, dividing it based off of kind of like some of the common features and everything. All right, so let's talk about loose versus dense. So some of the features that make up the proper, like how do you distinguish between what's loose and what's dense? Well, it's based off of two things. So you have reticular. So you have fibers and you have ground substance. So with loose proper connective tissue, there's going to be variations between the fibers and the ground substance. So some will have more fibers and some will have more ground substance. So I'm going to explain a little bit about ground substance, like what it is. I know it doesn't make sense right now, but we're going to elaborate on that. Okay, so with dense proper, there's going to be more of the fibers compared to the loose. Okay, with loose, there's going to be more of the ground substance, and the dense proper will have less ground substance. Okay, so let me explain like what I'm talking about when I talk about fibers versus ground substance. Okay, so with fibers, what we're concerned with is there's three main types. So you have the collagen, the reticular, and the elastic fibers. So those are the three types of fibers. That's what makes it up, okay? But then with ground substance, so we have the interstitial fluid. So interstitial fluid, proteoglycans, and then what is the, it's like carbohydrates and fats. That's the one. Okay, I'll come back to that. But, okay, can everyone, yeah, so we can see this, it's still in front of the torso. All right, so now let's go up and talk about the different subcategories between loose and dense. So when we have loose and dense over here, so what are the subtypes found within loose? So with loose, you have, so adipose is one, areolar is another one, and then the last type of loose is reticular. Okay, so for the dense type of connective tissue, you have elastic connective tissue. You also have, let's see, what is the other one? So we have elastic, regular, and also irregular. Okay, so I know it seems like a lot here, but it's going to start to make sense. We're just like trying to get a feel for it and then connect the dots using this kind of here as our skeleton. All right, so if we think about what I just said earlier about fibers and ground substance, okay, so with loose proper, there are less fibers and more ground substance. So remember that, less fibers and more ground substance. So if we look at these types of connective tissue, so adipose, areolar, and reticular, so what is stored in adipose tissue? Fat, right? So fat is stored there. So we're going to have, it's more of a fluid compared to elastic, regular, and irregular because they're having more of the fibers. So remember the fibers, it's collagen, reticular fibers, and elastic. So what those are, they're just like a lot of proteins. Okay, there are a lot of proteins like this interconnected network here that's kind of like providing structure for the cell, or it's for the extracellular matrix. That's where the ground substance and the fibers are found in the extracellular matrix, which is, when we say extracellular, what does that mean? Inside or outside the cell? Outside the cell. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So we're talking about like that network there. Okay, so for dense, right, we have all of these proteins that are kind of like intertwined with each other, and then for the loose, you have adipose, you have areolar connective tissue, and you also have reticular. So areolar is like the most abundant one that's found in the body because it has an immune component to it as well, including all three of these different fibers. And so that immune component that I was discussing, what that is the macrophages. So macrophages are these white blood cells that they basically break, it's called they phagocytize things. So they'll engulf them, break them down, so if like bacteria or anything like that, they'll just kind of gobble them up and then break them down into like smaller protein pieces, okay? So then for reticular connective tissue, this is a particular type of connective tissue that's found within like the spleen, and then also, if I move this neuron model, it's found here in the lymph nodes, okay? All right. So does this make sense for the, at least for the connective tissue proper and like kind of like the makeup of it?
What is the second word, underground?
So this is reticular.
Underground substance.
Oh, interstitial fluid and proteoglycans. Proteoglycans, yeah. So it's basically protein and sugar. Yeah, it's these molecules that are kind of like folded together. Okay, so we're going to revisit these topics once we get into the organ systems, okay? But this is like a general introduction of the different types and everything. Okay, so let's finish this here. So we have blood and lymph, right? We already know what blood is. It's something that circulates through the body. What does it transport? What does the blood transport? So we transport oxygen, right? Oxygen, we have to get oxygen to tissues. Carbon dioxide is also found. That's a metabolic byproduct. We also transport nutrients. You have to get nutrients to the body, and there's also like antibodies can be found and everything like that within the blood plasma. Okay. So for lymph is a particular fluid that will circulate through the lymph nodes. So the lymph nodes, that's what's here. There's also, like you'll have lymph nodes here. So if you go to the doctor, they'll go like this and check your lymph nodes to see if they're swollen or anything, because that could be an indicator of, like some type of infection or something like that. Okay, because that's where the lymph is traveling to circulate, to surveillance what's being in the body. Okay. All right, so now let's move to the supportive connective. So I talked about, we know what bone is, right? It's what muscles attached to, ligaments attached to. Then we also have different categories of cartilage. So you have elastic cartilage, you have fibro cartilage, and then we also have, so elastic, fibrocartilage, and what is the last one? Hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage. Okay. So we're going to, once again, visit where this is found and everything, but this is our overall view of the makeup of the different types of connective tissue. Okay. So this makes sense. No questions? Okay, all right, so that's going to be it for this lecture. So, yeah.